He had stolen $34,000 in her name, opened 7 credit cards, maxed every single one. The police told her there was nothing they could do. 18 months later, the prosecutor's office sent her a letter, and the only line in it that mattered was the second one. 5 stories tonight, pulled from the corners of the internet where ordinary people decided that the answer, "you can't do anything about that," was, in fact, optional. Some of these will make you laugh. One of them might make you check your own front door. A retail sales auditor demands 1 signature per receipt and gets exactly what he asked for, 1,847 times. A bride opens her wedding day inbox to find a forwarded email she wasn't supposed to see. A small-town postal worker finds a Christmas card list addressed to 23 dead people. A grieving woman holds a backyard funeral for a 14-year-old cat and looks up, mid-eulogy, to find a stranger filming her with a ring light. And a retired accountant, after a year and a half of paperwork nobody asked him to file, hands a district attorney a binder. Our first story comes from r/MaliciousCompliance. The narrator, we'll call her Joanne, had been working in the back office of a regional sporting goods chain for almost 12 years, processing departmental expense reports. Joanne's job was unglamorous and very specific. Every Friday, she received a stack of reimbursement requests from the chain's 23 retail locations and consolidated them into one corporate batch. Sales tax stickers, window cleaner refills. The 8-pack of pens a manager had bought from the gas station next door because corporate ordering took 6 weeks. Routine. Boring. That summer, the company brought in a new auditing manager from a consulting firm. Let's call him Steven. Steven, on his first all-staff meeting, presented a slide titled Operational Discipline. He explained that the department's expense process was, in his exact words, shockingly informal. Going forward, every expense reimbursement request, every single one, no exceptions, no minimum threshold, would require an itemized paper receipt with his wedding signature. Joanne, sitting in the second row, raised her hand. She pointed out that the average request was for items costing under $5. The pens. The 8-pack of pens. Steven interrupted. I said no exceptions. That includes the pens. Joanne went back to her desk and did the math. The chain processed around 1,800 small purchase reimbursements per quarter. If Steven wanted a wedding signature on every single one, he was going to be doing approximately 1.5 hours of signing per business day, just on the small stuff. And that was assuming Joanne batched them efficiently. She did not batch them efficiently. What Joanne began doing, instead, was submitting each receipt as a separate request. Not a batch of pens, a single pen. Not a box of paper clips, a single paperclip purchase. Not a roll of receipt paper, one roll, one receipt, one signature line on its own dedicated form. By the end of August, Steven had personally signed for 1,847 individual expense reimbursements, most of them under $1. What Steven did not realize, but Joanne did, and this is the part she says she still smiles about, was that Steven's own performance review at the consulting firm was tied to a metric called operational efficiency. Specifically, the number of hours senior staff spent on what the firm classified as manual processing tasks. Steven had spent, over the previous 3 months, by Joanne's quiet count from the sign-in logs, approximately 110 hours signing receipts that were almost entirely under $5. The email that arrived from his consulting firm on the 15th of September was, in her words, very polite. It also contained one specific clause that, by the terms of his contract, allowed the firm to terminate without cause if a quarterly metric fell below a defined floor. Steven's operational efficiency score had dropped to the lowest in the regional cohort. Not because he was inefficient in the abstract, but because every quarter hour he spent signing for a 60-cent purchase was logged against him by his own firm's tracking system, the system he himself had advocated installing. He was reassigned to a different account at a different city by the end of October. Joanne went back to processing batched expense reports. The wedding signature policy quietly disappeared from the staff handbook by the end of the next quarter. Joanne's last line in her post, I never told him. He still doesn't know. Steven's mistake was assuming the rules he was making applied only outward. Our next narrator's mother-in-law made a similar assumption, but she went looking for her wedding day audience much earlier in the morning. This story comes from our /JUSTNOMIL. Our narrator is 31, getting married on a Saturday in late October, and she wrote this post on the Monday before her wedding. Our narrator and her future mother-in-law had been estranged for almost 5 years. The reason, in her summary, was a Sunday dinner shortly after her engagement, in which the mother-in-law had said, in front of 14 family members, that our narrator was a manipulator who had trapped her son into the relationship and that she would never accept the marriage. The fiancé had taken our narrator's side then. He had not spoken to his mother for nearly 3 years. The wedding invitations had not included her. That changed partially in February of this year, when the mother-in-law had reached out through a family friend and asked for a fresh start. There had been a careful reconciliation, a coffee, a second coffee, a dinner. By August, she had been formally re-invited, with the explicit understanding from both our narrator and the fiancé that any repeat of the trapping conversation would end the relationship permanently. The mother-in-law had agreed. She had cried. She had said, our narrator says, all the right things. It was 7:14 a.m. on the Monday of the wedding week when our narrator's wedding planner forwarded her an email. The email had been sent that morning at 6:23 a.m. from the mother-in-law's personal address to a distribution list of approximately 75 wedding guests, every name and email of which had been scraped, presumably from the printed seating chart she had been mailed 2 weeks earlier. The body of the email asserted, in tone of careful concern, that our narrator had been struggling with mental health issues for years, that the marriage was being entered into under duress, and that the family wanted attendees to be aware of the situation. It included an attachment. The attachment was a one-page letter on what appeared to be the letterhead of a psychiatric practice in our narrator's hometown. Our narrator's wedding planner is the one who flagged it. The wedding planner had a college roommate who, by what our narrator describes as one of the most useful coincidences of her adult life, was a forensic document examiner. Our narrator forwarded the letter to the roommate at 7:20 a.m. that Monday morning. By 9:45 a.m., she had replied. The reply, our narrator says, contained 2 specific findings and a third sentence that determined what she did next. The first finding was that the letterhead was a near-perfect copy of a real psychiatric practice's letterhead, with one minor inconsistency in the kerning of the address line. The second finding was that the signature on the letter, when overlaid with publicly available signatures of the actual psychiatrist, did not match. The third sentence was simply, if you want, I can have a conversation with my old colleague at the State Attorney General's office tomorrow morning. Our narrator says she made one phone call before saying yes. She called her fiancé and asked him whether he was certain he wanted his mother in his life under any condition going forward. He told her he was certain he did not. The forensic document examiner had her conversation. The State Attorney General's office sent the mother-in-law a formal cease and desist letter on Wednesday. The wedding went forward on Saturday. The seating chart had a missing chair in row 3. The post's last line, she's facing a forgery charge. We are still on for the honeymoon. Sometimes the people who insert themselves into your most private moments do it in person, with cameras. Sometimes they do it through the postal service. Our next narrator works night shifts in a small-town post office. In the night she's about to describe, she found a list of names that wasn't supposed to exist. This story comes from our /nosleep. The narrator says he's been a postal sorter at a town he won't name for almost 9 years. He says he is posting from a town he just moved to, and he isn't going back. The post office in the town the narrator is leaving sat at the end of a residential road, in what used to be a feed store. The town itself had a population of about 1,100. There was one route. Mail volume on normal day was small enough that the night sort could be done by one person in about 4 hours. The narrator had worked the night shift for years, alone, with a radio and a thermos of coffee. He says it was, until the events of this post, the calmest job he had ever held. In December of last year, he was sorting Christmas cards for the route, a heavier than usual volume, but routine, when he came across a stack of 23 identical cream-colored envelopes. They were return addressed to a single house at 14 Elm Street. They were addressed individually to 23 different recipients, each at the same single mailing address, also 14 Elm Street. The sender and the recipient lived at the same house. He set them aside, assumed they were a clerical error, and intended to ask the postmaster about them in the morning. That night, on his break, he typed the recipient names, one at a time, mostly out of curiosity, into the small-town local history archive that the town's library hosted online. Each name returned an obituary. All 23. The most recent obituary was from 1994. The oldest was from 1953. 23 people, all of whom had lived in the town. All of whom had been dead for between 30 and 73 years. All of whom, this Christmas, were receiving a card. The next day, the narrator looked through the post office's archived mail records. He found that the same 23 cards had been sent every December from 14 Elm Street for the last 31 years. The narrator says he asked the postmaster about it that morning, very casually, while making coffee. He asked who lived at 14 Elm Street. The postmaster, in his words, paused for what felt like a longer than normal moment, and then asked the narrator a question instead. The question, our narrator says, is the part he can't get out of his head. The postmaster asked, "Why? Did you insert one with your name on it?" The narrator says he did not. He said, "No, of course not. What a strange question," and went back to his desk. The postmaster did not bring it up again. The narrator finished his shift normally that day. He says he checked the next December's batch carefully. He found nothing addressed to him. He says he checked the December after that. Nothing. He says he is posting this from a city 600 miles away, in a state he has never lived in before. He says he does not know whether the postmaster meant the question as a joke, or as a warning, or as something else entirely. He says that uncertainty is the part that finally moved him. The post's last line, "I am not waiting for the next December to find out. Some intrusions show up at your front door. Some show up in your mail. And some show up holding a phone camera ring light in the middle of your backyard while you are crying over the pet you have just buried." This story comes from our /AITAH. Our narrator is 38, married, and her cat, a 14-year-old gray tabby, had died on a Tuesday morning of natural causes. Our narrator and her husband had decided to bury the cat themselves in their backyard that Wednesday afternoon. The funeral, as she describes it, was small. It was her husband, her adult son who had grown up with the cat, and a handful of cards from the few neighbors who knew what the cat had meant to her. She had not invited her sister-in-law. Our narrator says her sister-in-law, let's call her Brittany, has in the last 18 months become what our narrator carefully describes as a lifestyle content creator. Brittany has, in the last 18 months, also begun showing up uninvited to most family gatherings carrying what our narrator calls her camera setup. It was 2:45 p.m. on the Wednesday of the funeral when Brittany walked through the back gate carrying a phone, a small ring light on a folding tripod, and what our narrator describes as a face she had clearly been preparing. Behind her was a second person, who our narrator did not recognize, holding a second phone at a different angle. Brittany walked up to the small open hole, said the cat's name in a tone our narrator describes as exactly 2 octaves higher than her speaking voice, and asked our narrator if she could share a few words to honor the moment. Our narrator, mid-eulogy, asked her, quietly, to leave. Brittany said it would only take a moment. Our narrator's husband, who had not spoken yet, asked Brittany to leave again, more firmly. Brittany said, on camera, that this was a deeply unfair moment for our narrator to be controlling other people's grief processes. Our narrator says she asked Brittany once more, very calmly, to leave. Brittany did not leave. The second person, who, it later turned out, was a freelance videographer Brittany had hired, kept filming. Our narrator's adult son finally walked over to Brittany and asked her, also very calmly, to leave. The exchange that followed, our narrator says, was loud enough to be audible from the kitchen, and the part that ended up on the local news the next day was the 4 words Brittany shouted as she crossed the lawn back toward the gate. The 4 words were, "This is your funeral." Our narrator's son had filmed the entire confrontation on his own phone. He had not been content creating. He had been documenting an unwanted person on private property who had been asked to leave. The clip, 14 seconds of Brittany shouting that line at the cat's open grave ended up, by the next morning, on the social media account of a local news station. Brittany's lifestyle content creator account was unverified, partially demonetized, and quietly archived within the week. The post is titled, "AITAH for not letting my SIL film at my cat's funeral." Our narrator says she received roughly 1,400 responses. None of them said yes. The thing about people who think they can do whatever they want is that they don't always learn quickly. Our last narrator tonight learned slowly, but he was very patient. He spent 18 months becoming the kind of person you want to know, on paper, before you steal $34,000 from him. This story comes from our /ProRevenge. Our narrator is 52, recently retired from a 30-year career as a corporate accountant, and, by his own description, a man who has spent a lot of his adult life keeping good records. The first sign was an alert from his bank on a Friday morning in October of the previous year about a credit card he had not opened. He called the bank. The bank closed the card. The next Tuesday, 2 more alerts. By the end of November, our narrator had counted 7 separate cards opened in his name, with combined balances totaling $34,000 and change. He filed a police report at the local precinct. The officer was apologetic. Identity theft cases of this scale were, the officer said, almost never prosecuted at the local level. There was no clear suspect, no surveillance footage, no obvious lead. The officer suggested our narrator file a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission and see what happens. Our narrator, that evening, opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, he wrote a single sentence. What evidence would the district attorney need? He spent the next 18 months answering it. He filed the Federal Trade Commission complaint immediately. He sent affidavits to each of the 7 card issuers, formally disputing every charge, requesting transactional metadata. He filed a state court motion compelling each issuer to produce IP logs from the application moments. 5 of the 7 complied. 2 required a follow-up subpoena, which he prepared himself with the help of an inexpensive online legal form service. The IP logs, he discovered, all originated from the same residential broadband account. He filed another motion, this time targeting the broadband provider for the subscriber records. The provider responded slowly, carefully, with the name and address of the account holder. The address was the house next door to his mother-in-law's. The broadband subscriber was the adult son of his wife's neighbor, a man our narrator knew vaguely, by face, because he had seen him at his mother-in-law's house roughly 4 times in the previous decade. Our narrator did not, at this point, walk over and confront him. He did not tell his wife. He did not tell his mother-in-law. He spent the next 6 months building what he describes as the binder. The binder was 3 inches thick, tabbed, color-coded, cross-referenced. It contained the 7 application records with their timestamps, the IP logs from each card issuer aligned to those timestamps, the broadband subscriber records aligning the IP to the suspect's residence, a timeline of charges traced to specific merchants, receipts and surveillance still frames our narrator had pulled by writing polite individual letters to each merchant, citing his FTC case number. He scheduled a meeting with the assistant district attorney for white-collar crime in his county. He brought the binder. The meeting, he says, took 40 minutes. He left it with her. A formal arraignment notice arrived in his mailbox 3 weeks later. The case had been filed. By the time it was prosecuted, about 10 months after the binder was handed over, the suspect had pled out. Restitution, $32,000, recovered to our narrator over the next 18 months. The remaining $2,000 the suspect had spent in ways our narrator says even the prosecutor described as embarrassingly traceable. The post's last line our narrator wrote with what reads as quiet professional satisfaction. I do not begrudge him the $2,000. I keep the record of it. I think of it as a tax. 5 stories. 5 people who heard, you can't do anything about that. From a manager, from a mother-in-law, from a postmaster, from an uninvited filmmaker, from a police officer, and went ahead anyway. Patiently, quietly, mostly with paperwork. If any of them landed for you, the channel keeps making these. Tuesday and Friday, every week. Hit subscribe, and you'll catch the next one without having to look for it. Thanks for listening. Sleep well. Most of these people eventually did. Chapters. JSON. Chapters. Title. The Receipts. Start_word. 165. Subreddit. MaliciousCompliance. Permalink. //maliciouscompliance /comments/pilot 2story 1/_receipt/. Title. The Wedding Week Email. Start_word. 1090. Subreddit. JUSTNOMIL. Permalink. //JUSTNOMIL/comments/pilot 2story 2/wedding/. Title. 23 names. Start_word. 2010. Subreddit. nosleep. Permalink. //nosleep/comments/pilot 2story 3/card/. Title. The Funeral Content. Start_word. 2895. Subreddit. AITAH. Permalink. //AITAH/comments/pilot 2story 4/funeral/. Title. The Binder. Start_word. 3700. Subreddit. ProRevenge. Permalink. //ProRevenge/comments/pilot 2story 5/.